Afterwards. Okay. So we're going. If other folks join us, then they can just join us, and that will be just fine. But I'm Reverend Katie Cuthill from First Presbyterian Church, Daytona Beach, also known as the Beach Street Church. And I'm joined today by a couple of friends. Dr. Teresa Hornsby, do you want to say a little bit? You teach and have taught in a couple places, so maybe you introduce yourself.
Okay, if I can remember. So I taught for 20 years at a small liberal arts college in Springfield, Missouri, named Drury University. And I semi-retired from there that now I teach entirely online and I teach for Chicago Theological Seminary and I teach occasionally for Vanderbilt Divinity School. And I have taught one course at Drew Theological School. So I hope to be offering something with them. I teach courses on intro Bible, Paul's letters, LGBT issues in the Bible. Um, I've taught a little bit of everything. So I love doing this. I love doing the work and just talking about it, but especially with Katie and everybody that I've met through Katie. They've just been wonderful conversation partners.
Love that. Thank you, Teresa. And so glad to have you with us. And I'm joined by Gary here and Holly and maybe Rick when you guys get your screens on and all of those things, who are regulars at the Beach Street Church and often join us in and have sort of thought-provoking ideas. But we are calling this little series Jesus 101. And Gary and Rick and Holly probably know this a little bit, but I'll tell you, Teresa, at Beach Street Church, we've had a number of folks who have come to become part of our church or become regulars at our church because they have felt excluded in other places. Maybe they weren't raised in the church. Maybe they're part of the LGBT community. Maybe they were raised in a different faith. Maybe they were raised in a Christian faith, but as their theology and understandings evolved, found that a more streamlined, fundamental viewpoint didn't fit them any longer. And they've sort of wrestled with how do we understand the things we were taught in our youth with the new revelation. And our tradition that I'm ordained into, the Presbyterian Church, we have a saying that we say, reformed and always being reformed. So I'm fortunate to be part of a tradition that creates space for different understandings, for new revelation, and for how we're being shaped by the divine. But in light of that, we kind of had this, well, okay, so we talk a lot about different theological concepts. We talk a lot about justice. We talk a lot about inclusion, and we sort of couch all that in how we understand gospel teachings. But we started kind of getting the question of, okay, wait, I need to understand who this Jesus fella is a little bit more, because who you're talking about and the things you're saying don't necessarily make sense with what I thought I knew about Jesus. So we decided we'd do a Jesus 101. This is our episode 3. So we sort of started with the first episode was, why do we even need to talk about this? Which is kind of the intro I've just given. Episode 2, we sort of talked about in the beginning, which we took both as in the ways that John, the book of John, talks about in the beginning, there was the Word, and the Word was God, and with God. So we talked a little bit about that, a little bit about Genesis, but then also how we understand the mythology, the theology, and the cultural context of the birth of Christ that is couched in these various narratives that are a little different in the different books of the Gospels, the scriptures. And then today, our hope is to focus in on some of the parables. So Jesus's teachings were so often couched in story. And maybe we even need to start with sort of the definition of parable, which I would say is really just a telling of a story to express a point, an idea. And often in Jesus's case, it wasn't just sort of like the moral of the story like we would think of in a fairy tale, but was often sort of subversive, kind of turning ideas upside down from how his cultural context, and I think it's still applicable how today we think about things. Would you add to that definition of parable, Teresa?
Yeah, just it's an extended metaphor, really. I mean, so they weren't meant. Well, every time I start to speak, I'm like, well, not quite. But I started to say they're not meant to be taken literally, Although sometimes I think when Jesus is talking about, let's say, laborers in the vineyard, I think he really is talking about people who are working in the vineyard, literally. But as you said, he uses that to bring a much larger point. And I really love what you said about it's a continuing story. The meanings just keep unfolding in front of us because of our own experiences. And so Jesus is speaking these stories to the people in his audiences,
Mhm.
and he's speaking to their experiences. But what's cool about these stories is they continue to speak to us through our experiences. So I just love that part about. So that's the only part I would add is that they're just longer metaphors, but they always mean something. They just don't always mean the same thing at all times to everybody at the same time. First, yeah.
I love that because that allows scripture to be alive. That allows it to
Mm-hmm.
be a book, a collection of texts and stories and letters and ideas that
Mm-hmm.
continue to develop us. And
Mm-hmm.
we sort of develop our understandings of it at the same time. And that
Mm-hmm.
makes it worthy of our time to me. If it's
Mm-hmm.
just a stagnant, dead thing in which everything has already been discovered, I don't have a whole lot of interest in dedicating my life to studying it and understanding it. So
Mm-hmm.
I'm
Mm-hmm.
grateful for the way that you couch that. I also think it's important to kind of point to, and you sort of played with this a little bit, Teresa, but the context. So I think
Mm-hmm.
sometimes what will happen with scripture and parables specifically, or various teachings of Jesus, is that a piece of it will be pulled out and kind of held up and said, okay, here are the things that I think, and I will use this little piece of this story in order to justify the things that I think and make a point out of it. And when we do that, it kind of removes it from the context in which sort of the larger point that's being made potentially by scripture, but also, you were talking about the vineyard and the laborers, so maybe we'll dive into that one. But there would have been a real live context group of people that Jesus would have been speaking to who would have heard this in
Mm-hmm.
a
Mm-hmm.
specific way. So I'm wondering if you have some thoughts about context and how we can tend to that well.
Mm-hmm. One of the things I would say specifically is that among scholars, and so when you look at Jesus's sayings and you look at his words and his teachings, almost every scholar agrees on something, which is super rare, but they agree that the parables are probably authentic to Jesus. So a lot of the things that we get that Jesus might have said, or something he might have preached, or a sermon, we're not 100% sure that he said those things. But with the parables, most scholars think those are absolutely authentic to Jesus. Now, but one of the problems is we get the parables told to us through a gospel writer, who's probably writing at least, let's see, if you get Mark, so you're probably at least 30, 40 years after Jesus's crucifixion, resurrection. And so, and you also get these stories from a viewpoint of let's just say Luke, for example. Luke is writing sometime, around probably in the 90s. And so this is probably 60 years after Jesus's death and resurrection. And so he is telling this parable for the benefit of his context. And so it's different than Jesus's context when he's originally telling the story. So Luke will nudge things a little bit. He will add his own commentary. He will, and sometimes you'll notice one gospel writer will tell a story, and you might notice who's in the audience. Sometimes it's the disciples, sometimes it's women listening, sometimes it's a group of lawyers listening. And then another gospel writer will tell the same story and to a different audience. So just to keep that in mind, that I believe we have authentic words of Jesus, but they're told to us through a different lens and through a different context than Jesus immediately did, which I think is great. I think it's brilliant because it tells us that depending on our circumstances and our life experiences, we receive these stories differently, and we can send those stories out differently.
Mm.
And they mean differently. And it doesn't, anyway, that's
Yeah.
why I love the parables. They're always evolving, and they're always relevant, I think.
And I love that you pointed out audience. So for me, one of the ways that that's really relatable is, I have two children. And I have two very different children. One of my children is a real push the boundary, like, just right at the edge of things, challenges everything. And that is a child to whom I often have to say, okay, I need you to back off a little bit. Okay. And then I have another child who's my peacemaker, who wants to please everybody, who wants everybody to like them. And to that one, I'm like, no, 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 it's okay to come forward a little bit, to be, so as I think about that, I'm like, wow, I could say the same thing and mean different things to these two children, or I could say very different things with the same goal in mind, right? Of sort of leveling the playing field a little bit, if you will. And so as I hear you describe that, if Jesus has a message and he's giving this story, which is intended to imbue some meaning, and he's doing it to very powerful people, these lawyers you talked about, Pharisees, people like that versus if he's telling a story to a very marginalized group of people, people who would have been outcasts, Samaritans, or the very poor, or otherwise disabused folks. That makes a big difference in how we take that. And I think sometimes I hear folks will take a story that Jesus was giving to a very powerful group of people. Okay, so it's about, watch yourself, don't get yourself mixed up with God. But
Mm-hmm.
then people will take that story and go, let me tell you, little ones, don't you get mixed up with God. I know what's what. You know what I mean? So, can you help us with how do we have a fuller understanding of how Jesus is attempting to use these stories to teach lessons?
hmm I think one of the most important things, well, I would say this because I'm a Bible scholar person. So, but I just really encourage people to look into the history, look at that first century context and understand. And you'll see things that are so similar to what we have today, but you'll see a place where you have, so Jesus's time, the Jews are living in an area that is completely occupied by the empire, and they are being taxed literally off their land. They have a lot of trouble paying the taxes and keeping themselves with food and housing and health. And so then you have Jesus coming around, it seems to me, who is offering precisely those things. He's offering food and he's offering free health care and he's offering all of this stuff and he's explaining why he's doing this through his parables, and so much of his parables have to do with especially like you were saying, if he has more affluent people in his audience, he talks a lot about sharing your wealth. And he and he's not saying give up your wealth. He's like distribute your wealth, use it when other people don't have certain things and so forth. So um, context is super important to find out this world to which Jesus walked and what he's saying in that context. And the other thing is that happens to parables, and I've talked about this a lot, is that they tend to get when they get preached on and when they get taught in, let's say, a Sunday school class, people tend to use a lot of anti-Jewish stereotypes in these things to say, oh, the Pharisee, he represents the Jews who are supposedly this way or that way. And so Jesus wouldn't have told stories like that because he is a Jewish man speaking to Jewish people. And the Pharisees, for example, that people think are always the bad guys, were actually very much revered by the people to whom Jesus was speaking. So that's just a little bit of that is like learn about that context, know who the Pharisees are, because if you get that context wrong, you get Jesus wrong. So it becomes a caricature of Judaism, and if you got a caricature of Judaism, you've got a caricature of Jesus. So that's one of the things I would say just off the top of my head. I would be like, learn the context.
I'm writing down, if you get the
Mhm.
context wrong, you get Jesus wrong, because I need
Well,
to.
and I'm mostly quoting Amy Jill Levine on a lot of this stuff, so I don't want to take credit on all of this, but this is quoting somebody else too. Yeah.
Yeah, and it also kind of strikes me the difference between my, so an example for me, if I say, all right, ladies, listen, this is how we need to behave and we need to stop doing this other thing, right?
Mhm.
That's
Mhm.
very different coming from me who is a female than
Mhm.
if, some strong, powerful man was to say, okay, ladies, this is how you need to behave. This is what you need to do, right? So that
Mhm.
for
Mhm.
me, I think this feels like new information for me to sort of couch the idea that when Jesus is talking to Pharisees and he uses some harsh words from time to time,
Mhm. Mhm. Mhm.
that he's speaking to them as one of them in a way, right? He is
Mhm.
a Jewish teacher of renown, well, becomes
Mhm.
of renown.
Mhm.
So if he has a harsh word, that's like saying, hey, y'all, we gotta almost
Mhm.
versus
Mhm.
just,
Mhm.
you gotta. And I think that's really helpful for me, one, in understanding why one might have a harsh word like that.
Mhm. Mhm.
But two, points me back to that context when I hear folks pull a line, you brood of vipers,
Mhm.
or something like that, and use it to apply sort of a harsh lens to Christ or a harsh lens to the people that that particular person is frustrated with or thinks is wrong.
Mhm.
So, I mean, I think that's part of what I've also picking up from what you're sharing is like, if I take this and just use it to justify what I already think,
Mhm.
I have I've effectively eliminated Christ from it and just inserted myself.
Mhm. Mhm. Mhm.
And that gets messy quick. I mean, that's
Mhm.
some first commandment stuff right there. Like,
Mhm. Mhm.
so let's dive in a little bit to a parable. And I'm thinking, since you'd already brought up the vineyard and the vineyard workers, I'll give a brief Katie synopsis, and you can fill in anything you think I've missed that might be real valuable. Um, and we can kind of unpack it a little bit. So in the story of the vineyard workers, effectively what happens, there's a vineyard owner and he needs some workers. Safe to assume he needs some workers, and he goes and gathers some people to come work the field, and he says, hey, I'm going to pay you a full day's wage. And then he, a quarter of the way through the day, picks up some more people and says, hey, I need you to come work. I'll pay you a full day's wage. And then sort of halfway and then sort of end of the day. So the last group of workers works a very small portion of the day. But when it comes time to get paid, he says, I told you I'd pay you and I pay you. Now, the trick is, and I'm going to forgive me, friends, if I mute you. If I do that, I'm picking up some background. I'm not telling you can't talk. Um, but so it comes to the end of the day, and everybody lines up to get their pay. And the people who've been there all day working get the same amount as the people who showed up at the end. And they're like, whoa, 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 that don't seem right. I've been here all day and I'm getting the same amount as this last guy who's only been here a couple hours. That doesn't seem right to me. And I think all of us can identify a little bit with a sense that feels unjust. And
Mhm.
the vineyard owner replies something along the lines of, hey, basically, this is what I said I'd do, and who are you to tell me how to spend my money?
Mhm.
And so Jesus was always sort of shifting what we presumably understood, right? What would be fair? What would be fair is that, you get paid for the time you work and you don't get paid for the time you don't. But then there's this thing called grace
Mhm.
that my understanding is even a little better than fair. Maybe it's a lot better than fair. And that's what I sort of pick up that Jesus is attempting to teach about. What did I miss from the story though? Did I miss anything important or
No, it sounded
gloss
great. It
over?
sounded great.
The
In
gospel
the
according to Katie.
yeah, um, yeah, because they come so they're in the thing, I guess in the marketplace, and they go around the first thing in the morning. They pick them up, and he promises them, and the Bible says a denarii, which if you do some research, and it says that's pretty much what a day's wage is. Like he promises them to pay them a fair day's wage, and but the part that I guess makes those workers crazy is the guys who only work 1 hour get a full day's wage. And I think you said it precisely. I mean, it is an idea of grace, that it's not how long you've been or how much maybe that you've worked. It's just that you are given grace, that you're provided. And and um and and a way that we would like to read this, I think, a meaning, I never will say the meaning, but a good way to think about this is that Jesus is literally saying everybody deserves a living wage, whether they work or not, or how little they work, even if they don't work at all, that they deserve they deserve to have enough money to provide them a living wage, which means that you have enough money to buy food and to have housing and to have basic health care or something like that. So that is just a fun way to think about that.
Yeah, just the
Yeah,
basic
yeah.
needs. So then that both sort of addresses how folks might have felt at the time. Now, hey, wait a minute here. And then also
I
Mhm.
gives
always,
some application. Did somebody want to
I
jump in?
always,
Go ahead.
yeah, I always thought it was actually not about money or anything like that or wages. I always thought it was coming into the kingdom of God. No matter when you decide to believe that you will always be in the kingdom of God.
Mm,
Yes, and it's not anything that you do. It is grace, as Katie says. It's
Right.
not.
Yeah.
It does. It's not how hard you've worked or how little or how
hmm
much you've done. It's just freely given grace.
hmm
And Gary, did
So
I
if you be,
correctly see some emotion come up with that?
oh, of course, I always do. Now, no matter when you believe, at the beginning of the day or middle of the day, you're always going to be able to get into the kingdom of God.
Mm,
And I think that's a parable that,
yeah. It reduces the obstacles. And I think that's one of the bones I have to pick often when I hear these parables and teachings sort of narrowed down into this one idea of this is what it means, and this is how
Mhm.
you get a taste of heaven, and this is
Mhm.
one way. And that, in light of this particular parable, it seems like how could we possibly get to that idea from this idea of, as you kind of put it, Gary, when whatever whenever whenever you come into this idea, whenever you begin your journey, whenever you say, yeah, I'll work, whether it's early or late or long time or short time or morning, noon, or night, there's a space for you.
I'd like to interject something.
Go ahead,
Uh,
please.
okay. So, so it occurs to me that the announcement that the vineyard owner needs workers goes out. And those who are right there to read the announcement or hear the announcement immediately and are close by agree and get a full day's wage for a full day's work. There are others who want to respond, but for various reasons, and I like your word obstacle, for various reasons, can't get to the vineyard, some of them until the last hour of the day.
Mm,
Grace comes in and says, God's grace comes in and says, I understand your journey. I understand the difficulty you had getting here. You're getting the full day wage because, you know, uh, you couldn't get here for various obstacles, whatever they were. You had to take care of ailing parents first, or you had other obligations, or maybe it was your own sin. But whatever it was, you got here.
mm,
I understand. And you're going to get paid.
yeah.
And so I kind of fill it in that way. The
I love
call went out, and they all didn't either hear it at the same time or they couldn't respond due to due to life circumstances, but they get there
mm,
and they're ready to work when they get there and they're rewarded. So that's kind of how I sometimes
yeah.
uh, put some flesh on those bones.
I love that. Well, one of the things I think that's being beautifully illustrated here is how we can hear some different pieces of this that are landing, because both in Gary's sharing and in yours, Rick, it's almost tangible, the sense of spirit, the sense of connection with this idea, with this story. And I think that's part of why Jesus taught in parables, was because they were memorable. Like Teresa was saying, it's like we don't agree about everything Jesus said or taught. The Gospels, I mean, read all of them. They're different. They have different stuff in them, you know. But scholars seem to agree that these stories, these memorable stories, to illustrate how kingdom works, how God works, how grace works, these sort of intangible concepts. We're given these tangible stories that we get to unpack, whichever ways we kind of come into them. And they connect. They connect on this deep level with what we know it means to be human and how we experience whatever little taste of the divine we each get, which is one of the values in studying them in groups. Go ahead, Teresa.
Yes, yes, yes. And I wouldn't kick out the economic reading because I love, just the idea that we can connect here the kingdom of God and God's grace to also being a good steward of your fellow people. Like you make sure that they have an honest wage, that they can support themselves. And to me, that just goes hand in hand, that's a commandment. That you make, according to me, right? It's just make sure that everyone is taken care of, and they can have dignity. It's just a sense of, and as a person who follows Jesus, then you would say, everyone has access to God's grace, no matter when we came to, for whatever reasons in our lives, that if we were late getting to that courtyard or the marketplace where they were picking up the vineyard, it still is an economic issue. That it's all entwined. I don't think you can separate it out and say, oh, it could be a matter of grace, or it could be about God's kingdom, or it could be economics. I think it's all of these things. And you have to think Jesus literally used laborers in the vineyard to talk about in the story. So he could have used something else, but he uses often a woman who is looking for something, or a shepherd. But in this particular case, it's workers, and it's about economic justice for these workers. And so then the workers are complaining, some of them are complaining, and so they're passing judgment. So there's another one. It's like, don't be all judgy, especially of God's grace. If God is giving the grace to these people, it's not your business. But I like the idea that part of God's grace is seeing that everyone has dignity and that they have access to a daily wage so they can support themselves and their families.
Yeah. And it's kind of just keeps unfolding, so this is really making a beautiful example. It occurs to me too, I mean, as our conversation has developed, we've kind of continued to think of all of these workers as different people, but it just hit me. All of these workers could be me, meaning the ways that I understand. I came to faith young. I am a womb Presbyterian, not even a cradle Presbyterian. Okay. Like I was definitely raised my whole life, but my understandings have changed dramatically. And I think there's a sense of, oh no, I had it wrong. And the grace pours over that too, because I'm going to continue to develop. And I mean, in my 40s, I'm feeling like, uh-oh, I'm a little late to the party here. Hold on. There's a whole other layer of understanding, of revelation that's available. Now, will I not have access to grace, to kingdom, to Jesus, to God, because I didn't understand this earlier in my journey? I think this parable tells me that's not the case. That there is an allowance for the continued revelation. So it's not just, I think we do that to ourselves too, where we go shame, guilt, these kinds of things. Oh, these are the people that I've ostracized before. I've ostracized myself. I used to believe the same thing, whatever it is. And it's so hard to extend that grace to ourselves. So I could even see these different laborers being sort of our different understandings as we continue to engage a gospel of grace and that reveals itself. So, see, new things every day. I had never thought
Isn't
of
it
that.
fun?
Isn't it fun? So
Isn't it fun?
you mentioned lost. You mentioned the lost. So there's several parables where Jesus seems to talk about something that's lost, that is of value, that needs to be found. So there's a woman who loses a coin and she searches until she finds it. There's the popular story of the lost sheep, where the 99 are left behind and the shepherd seeks the one that is lost. And maybe the most popular, if I dare say so, is the prodigal son. So this is the son that takes his inheritance. He goes off, he blows it, he ends up in ruins. He comes home and is received with grace, right? Is received with, welcome. That, if we want to do prodigal son, that one has developed for me greatly over my life of sort of understanding, of wanting a simplistic idea that the Father is God and the son is me, the terrible sinner. And then there's this brother, and and he doesn't like how this is going down because he's always been the good one. So why does the prodigal that comes home, why does he get treated so nicely? But just sort of putting ourselves in each of these character spaces, or maybe only one of them. I find that one to be good. Jesus often talking about something lost that needs to be found. And do you have a sense, Teresa, of how that would unfold in sort of that flipping upside down of cultural understandings that Jesus was always trying to do, seem to be?
Yeah, I know that parables are supposed to be just like, and so I think, that to me, this particular parable is one, like you say, it evolves and evolves. And I get a sense that he really is talking specifically about family relations in this one, that there's not the father isn't God. And I don't think it works as like this represents this or this represents that. I think he's really talking about a family here and something that really happens, that this son goes to him and requests his inheritance now. Like, I want all my money right now. And then, I don't want to wait until you're dead. I just want to go ahead and take it. So he takes it all and he blows it. And it tells us, in the scripture that he spends it on loose women, I think, and something else. But anyway, he just blows it. And so he decides he's out on he's out wherever, and he realizes, and he's working for somebody, and he's feeding pigs, which alone, I think there's a something there. If he's the pigs are the lowest of the animals, and you're not supposed to eat them, and you're not supposed to. So anyway, so he's feeding the pigs, and he comes to this realization. He's like, oh man, he's like, even my father's servants would eat better than I am. So I'll just go home and I'll just apologize. And so he has this all worked up in his head. He's got this speech, and you can hear him just like memorizing it. Father, I've been blah blah blah. So he gets home, and he doesn't even get to say his speech. His father sees him, and he runs out and welcomes him home. But the kid, you just wonder, like, does he learn anything? Like, he took all his money and he went out and blew it. And then he comes back, and then the father, wraps him up, takes him all in, throws him a big party. And then, so out in the field, the older brother is laboring. He's working, he's out there. He's been working and working. And he's like, what's going on? And so the father doesn't even tell the older son that his brother has returned, and they're rejoicing. The brother has to ask a servant. And the servant's like, well, your brother came home, and and so you wonder if the lesson here isn't about this father, the thing he lost. It wasn't the young son. He's lost his older son. Like, he doesn't even notice him. Like, the guy is out there working his butt off. I'm sorry, I keep using language that I'm forget that we're on. Like, okay, but he's just working, he's working and working. He's doing everything he's supposed to be. He's the good son. But this father doesn't recognize that. And so all he has done is paid attention to Junior, and he's given Junior everything. And then Junior comes back, and Junior gets lots more stuff. And by the way, I guess all the rest of the stuff that Junior gets should actually belong to the other brother because he's already taken his part, right? And so now everything he's consuming. So you're just wondering, the whole thing is like, this father, what he lose? I think he lost the older brother. And the older brother's like, hey, I'm right here. You're not counting me like the shepherd's counting all the sheep. Like, you're not counting me. You've missed me. So anyway, that's just something like these stories, I think about them and they always pop up differently, every time I think about them. They're just, yeah. Anyway, any thoughts about
Well, and
any
the,
of
the
that?
piece
Yeah.
that connects for me too is just the idea of like, but that's not fair. You
Yeah,
know, I
no.
can sort of
Yeah,
hear the older
yeah.
brother. I could hear the other laborers in the vineyard. You know, I can hear the other 99 sheep baaing. Like,
Yeah,
it's not
what about us over
fair.
here?
Yeah, it's not fair. And that resonates with my experiences as a youngest child. You know, hey, wait a second. Don't forget about me. It's not fair, or even as a mother now with my own children, that sense of, it's not fair, and attempting to be some version of fair. Like, we highly prize that as a
Hmm.
virtue, to be
Hmm.
fair.
Hmm.
And I keep hearing these gospels tell me, no, fair isn't the ultimate goal here, or at least not Katie's version of fair.
Yeah. And if you think about, like, even the shepherd, so if he goes off and leaves his 99, what keeps them from just scattering? So is the shepherd being like, he lost the sheep in the first place? So when he goes off and leaves all the others, is he being irresponsible? And so is the father here. He lets the kid go. He's not paying attention to his other son. Is he being somehow irresponsible? Um, anyway, it just like, yeah. And the unfairness, I always think of like when you're in school and you're doing that group project and you're working so hard on that group project and you got somebody in there who's not doing any work. My students always hated doing group projects because there was always one or two who just didn't do the work. And there was always somebody who did all the work. And I bet you were that person, Katie. I bet you were the and but they did all the work and then everybody gets the same grade. So there's a sense of unfairness in that. And so I think Jesus was brilliant in drawing on that everybody could relate to this. They're like, well, that's just not fair. And you want fairness. And Jesus is flipping it and just like, it's grace. It's like everybody gets it. It's all here. There's enough for everybody. And maybe the father was like, yeah, I should have. And he finally ends up telling the son, it's like, I've always loved you, but maybe you should tell him a little bit more. I don't know.
Yeah, so my dad used to say this thing to me as a kid, and I mean, he has probably said it to me in adulthood too, but I just remember it from my childhood. And he would say, Katie, there's nothing you can do to make me love you any more or any less. And sometime in adolescence for me, that went, now wait a minute here. I can be, I can be perfect. I can be so good, and I don't get any more love. Are you sure?
That's very freeing, though.
But well, that would be the idea of unconditional. But how funny that my brain had to turn that into some kind of loss
Mm-hmm.
instead of allowing it to be the unconditional offering that was intended. And that's
Mm-hmm.
what I hear in these parables, I think, too, is it's not, we all assume, well, that's a dangerous start to a sentence, but many of us assume that we're the worker who's been there all day. And that's why it has a sense of unfair to me. I'm assuming I've been there all day. I'm the brother who's been there the whole time. I've been here the whole time. Didn't you hear me? I'm a multi
I
Presbyterian.
deserve all of it.
So I should get more. I should have extra. And I think that's part of what a lot of the stories I hear, a lot of the parables, one, tell me, hey, stop measuring against everybody else. Stop measuring against everybody else. I'm gonna make sure you have what you need, little girl. That's one of the things I hear in this. And the other idea is, Katie's sense of justice may or may not equate God's sense of justice, of fairness. And as you've said, boy, isn't that freeing? Now all of a sudden, I don't have to be God anymore if it's not up to me to
Mhm.
measure everybody else.
Mhm.
What a relief. And furthermore, if I've messed up by trying to be God and I got there late to the party because I spent all that time trying to be somebody I wasn't supposed to be, there's grace for that too. I mean, that's a gift.
Mhm.
I don't think there's any other word for that besides gift. And yet, boy, is it easy for me to get into the, well, now wait a second, that person over there, and measuring them and deciding if I got my fair share of grace. Ooh, I need to write a book called My Fair Share of Grace.
That's good.
But
Fair
I
share.
don't want to shut out Gary or Rick and Holly. If either any of you had a thought or comment as you hear parables about lost things.
Nope.
Well, I hope that that there's some encouragement for you in there. Oh, I see you unmuted, Rick. Did you have a thought, or Holly?
No,
Oh,
just
just unmuting to be present. Okay. So we talked a little bit about these vineyard workers. We talked a little bit about these lost things. Are there other parables that kind of stand out for you, Teresa, that maybe are misinterpreted often, or we sort of lose the threads of these understandings? I mean, are they all about grace?
I don't know. That's a great question. Um, I think probably you were saying that the prodigal son um, is probably one of the most well known that people tend to know, but I think one of the other ones would be that the one that we call the Good Samaritan. Um, so maybe we'll talk about that one a little bit. And the reason I like to talk about that one is because people tend to just tidy that one up and make it really neat and tidy and put a little bow on it and go, oh, it's so easy to understand. This is the story, and this is, who is your neighbor, and people think they have it really figured out and that it's simple. And I always like to go through that one because I think it might be one of the most radical of Jesus's parables of what he is calling us to do and how we can be a good neighbor and what that means. And so maybe just tell that story a little bit. And so if anybody I mean, you do a great job in paraphrasing these
The Katie
parables. So just
paraphrases. Okay,
yeah,
so I think something that's important, and not everybody starts the story here, but I will, is who Jesus is talking to. So to honor kind of
mhm.
what we've been talking about, some of the teachers, some of the great minds, the Pharisees, the lawyers, the people who are, and when we say lawyer, we don't think of it in the same way that we think of now, because the law was the Jewish law, was the first five books of the Bible as we know it now. But that's what they would have been well versed in, is how we're told to live according to the Jewish law. This is what the Pharisees would have been well versed in, and they're sort of. It seems as if sometimes the Pharisees are kind of prodding at Jesus to say, "Well, tell us how to respond in this situation. Well, tell us how to,
Mhm.
what we should know." And in one of these kinds of conversations, Jesus says, "Well, you know the commandments. You know what's right," and basically boils it down to love God and love your neighbor as yourself. These are the greatest things you need to know, and gets the question back, well, who is my neighbor? And that's the context in which Jesus tells the story of the Good Samaritan, which in the very brief Katie version is, there's a man who is beaten and robbed on the side of the road, and coming by comes a Levite, comes a very religious person, and they sort of move to the other side of the road and they walk on by, and then down comes another religious, a Pharisee. Is it a Pharisee? Another religious, law-knowing, educated person, and they sort of move to the other side and walk on by. And then comes a Samaritan, and without unpacking too much, in Jesus's culture, this would have been somebody who's really looked down upon, frowned upon, different, other, not accepted. And the Samaritan comes by, sees this robbed and beaten man, picks him up, puts him on his, takes him to the local inn, nurses him back to health to the best of his ability, and then pays the inn to help him continue to get better while the Samaritan goes on his business and says, whatever it costs, I'll come back and pick up the bill. And and Jesus says, so who is the neighbor? Who is your neighbor? And I think the quick and tidy sort of takeaway that I often hear is, well, be the good Samaritan, help people out, just be a helper, be a helper. That's what a Samaritan is. They're a helper. And as you were alluding to, it's more complex than that. So walk us through some of the complexity.
Well, one of the things is, so as a reminder, Jesus is Jewish, speaking to Jewish people. And so when he's telling this story, the people in the audience would have fully expected the Levite to stop. They would have fully expected the second one to stop. And you said Pharisee, and now in my brain, I can't remember if it's like,
Yeah,
I should know this. I've read it 40,000 times. Thank you. But it was somebody that's also associated with the temple. I almost had it. I almost popped it. Anyway, that these people in Jesus's audience would have fully expected both of these people to stop, and they would have been shocked that they hadn't stopped. And so part of the problem is we get a lot of these stories, especially this one is only in the Gospel of Luke. And Luke is writing at a time when his group of Christians are in pretty fierce competition with Pharisaism, and so is Matthew's community. And so they tend to vilify the Pharisees. But these are not Jesus's people. Jesus's people would not have thought the Pharisees or the Levite or any other person who's associated with the temple. Priest, yes. They would not have vilified those people. They would have fully expected the priest and the Levite to stop, because for Jesus's people, they're honorable. And so they're associated with the law. And so for Jesus's people, the law is holy. And so anybody that's connected with that and connected with the temple system at the time of Jesus, they would have been good. And so they're at this point in the story, they're pretty shocked that these people didn't stop. And so then the third one comes along, it's a Samaritan. And so just the name of this story leads us down a path. I mean, just the Good Samaritan. It's like, today if we said, the good lesbian, or it's just an idea that there's this idea that the others may not be good, but this one's special. This is a good one. And so that's already loaded. And so, as you were saying, the Jews of Judea at this time did not like the Samaritan Jews. They were completely different. They had different theology. They were ethnically different. And so I don't know if hate it might be too strong of a word, but they were not friendly. So a lot of people tell this story, and it's like, it really works well if you can imagine, if you can tell the story and think of two people that you would say would absolutely stop on this way. So I would be like, so I'd tell the story like, there's a guy and he's beaten and he's in the ditch, and here comes Reverend Katie. So everybody would expect you to stop because you're a really, really, really nice person. And you're a church person and church people. So it'd be like, here comes Reverend Katie. Katie would totally stop. And Katie's like, oops, I am so in a hurry. I'm scooting around, and you didn't stop. So everybody'd be surprised. So then you'd think of who's the second person that didn't stop. I can't think of anybody else that would be like, so
how about
awesome.
Richard Rohr?
So Richard Rohr would totally stop.
Totally.
Richard just goes on. And then you got to think, and to make this like really hit home, you've got to put somebody in that Samaritan spot that you would never expect to stop and help this person out. And it becomes the radical story that when the people you fully expect would stop and help, and they don't. And then the person who is your maybe hated enemy, or somebody you just despise, or just you feel like they have no moral quality whatsoever.
So like the racist stops and helps?
Sure, maybe, yeah, maybe somebody that you just have a problem forgiving, it's hard to find forgiveness in your heart for this person. And they do it. And they not only help them, but as you say, they leave the credit card with the innkeeper and say, whatever happens, just charge it to my account. So it's an amazing story. And then he comes back and it's like, which one of these is my neighbor? Anyway, I just love that story. It's always evolving and just um,
Yeah.
Well, the other part of it is that he says they moved to the other side of the road too.
mhm,
It wasn't just that they passed by,
right.
but they moved.
Actively
Which
avoiding.
suggests that they see him, that they see the
Oh,
person. It's not like they didn't even see him, but they know he's in there. So they
right.
made a movement away. Yeah, that's a really good point. Yeah.
And he was just a Samaritan too. He wasn't a good Samaritan. He was just a Samaritan.
Just a Samaritan, right?
We put the
Just a
good on
guy.
there.
Exactly. We put the good on there. And it's just a guy on his way somewhere. And one of the historical things is like this place between Jerusalem and Jericho was known in those days as being just like rife with bandits. It's like, so I think even at the beginning, when Jesus probably started the story and said there was a guy and he's on his way from Jerusalem to Jericho, the audience right away would have went, oh no,
Yeah.
oh my gosh, that's terrible. Because it'd be like today, it's like, oh, there was a lady walking downtown at 3 a.m. all by herself. And already this audience knows that something's about to happen. So Jesus is setting that up. Like they know this area, it's a crime area, it's dangerous. Anyway, it's just brilliant, brilliant.
And I appreciate the way that the question is asked. I'm looking it up right now so I can quote instead of give the Katie paraphrase. So, an expert in the law stood up to test Jesus. This is from the NIV New International Version. Okay. An expert in the law stood up to test Jesus. Teacher, what must I do to inherit eternal life? This is the part we start off. It's written in the law. How do you read it? He answers, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, with all your mind, and love your neighbors yourself. Jesus says, you've answered correctly. Do this and you will live. But he wanted to justify himself, so he asked, and who is my neighbor? And that's when Jesus tells the story. So it's the teacher of the law, it's the expert in the law that is saying, who is my neighbor, when this story is told. And then Jesus ends it. He tells the story that we've kind of gone through. And then which of these do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of robbers? So the expert is saying, who is my neighbor? And then Jesus kind of turns it around and says, who was the neighbor to him? And in that, I hear this call to sort of not make it about me. Do you see where I'm trying to go with it? Like he sort of flips it upside down. Like, who is the neighbor? Who am I supposed to help? Because I'm going to be the good guy. And then the way that Jesus answers feels to me, now I haven't exegeted it from the original Greek, but it feels to me like Jesus is kind of saying, no, put yourself in the shoes of the robber. Who was the neighbor to the man? And I don't know, it just kind of strikes me in the way that it's asked and answered. I may need to study that a little bit more, but I think so often the thread we pull from this is be the good one, and I think part of what I'm hearing in this is, what if you're the beat up one, and how do you want to how does that shift the perspective if you're not just choosing between the three people, who's the good guy, who should you be, It says, what happens when it's you that needs help, I see lips moving over there. Hey.
It's like you both are saying that this is a parable about expectations.
Say more.
The audience, Jesus's audience, has certain expectations, and he plays with that. The person lying and robbed and beaten probably has expectations, and he's been surprised probably by them. And as we try to understand the story, are challenged to revisit our expectations about who can we expect help from? Who should we expect help from? And who and what kind of help should we be offering?
Mm.
That maybe it's time to re-examine our expectations in those circumstances. So the story challenges us on several levels about expectations.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think this idea too, because in others of Jesus's teachings, he talks a lot about what's real wealth. It's not just tangible wealth, but it's sort of these intangible things. And for me, that's part of what's highlighted in what I hear as you sort of were talking, Rick, about the help I need may be coming from an unexpected place because where I am lying helpless,
Mm-hmm.
I got a place to live. I got enough to pay my bills. That's not the kind of lying helpless I am. I'm a
Mm-hmm.
whole other kind of lying helpless, and it's going to take a whole other kind of person to help me out of that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Which is why I think it's so important that we have a community of people around us that aren't all like us. I think it's a great gift that at Beach Street Church that we have, queer folks, straight folks, poor folks, rich folks, white folks, black folks. There's a lot of different folks at that table, in that room, in that time, in that space together. And not all of us can be at the same place at the same time. But I think, well, I'm standing up in front of you almost every Sunday. I think you probably come thinking I'm going to teach you something, but I think very often it ain't me.
Mm-hmm.
It ain't me where you're going to learn the big brand new thing. If I'm lucky, I get to point at it, and if I'm lucky, I point in the right direction. But I think it's from each of us and from the different voices, and particularly from those who have been othered, which is part of what I hear in this story. This Samaritan is other, and we have
And he's
access.
been put down all his life because he's a Samaritan
Mm-hmm.
by the Jews.
Mm-hmm.
And technically,
so he has
is
to come
Jewish.
along and, I'm sorry?
The Samaritan is Jewish. He's just a different,
Just a
different
sect,
Yeah.
I guess. Okay.
Yeah.
But yeah, he's been put down. He may have been ridiculed for being another sect or whatever of the Jewish people.
Yeah.
But still, he come along. He doesn't care who it is.
Again, I'm hearing that call of stop pointing the fingers and judging and measuring and deciding where God's grace will come from, or how much of it we ought to get. So,
And as you share that about the Samaritan, which I hadn't really understood that way before, that he was that was another sect of Judaism,
Mm-hmm.
but it puts a spotlight on the Jewish community, if you will, how diverse and divided it probably was into various groups, all of them judging, all of them holding their own. And then Jesus is trying to get through to them. What a tough job that guy had.
Mm-hmm.
He's trying to get through to all these, even to get through to his own people, to get them to see the unity and the oneness that God sees. It was a tough job.
I got to go.
Well, we've kind of reached our time here, but I'm so grateful for these conversations and just to continue to avail ourselves of the possibility of revelation. I mean, that's how I see, folks being willing to come into this space and share and teach. Teresa, thank you for bringing yourself and your wisdom, and I hope you'll come back and visit with us again. As we continue to sort of look at Jesus 101, which turns out isn't just for beginners.
Yeah, right. I just have to throw in one thing is that there are lots of sects of Judaism during Jesus's time, but they weren't. Just something he said is like that they were being judging and they were judging one another. But I think that's often a misunderstood concept. I think Jesus I think Jesus's audience shared the same vision of God that he does, that he did, and that
Uh-huh.
he was leading them and showing them different things. But just like today in Christians with different denominations and so forth, they're not going to agree on everything. But that doesn't mean they're not good people, and that it doesn't mean that they're all judgmental. So I just wanted to make sure that we didn't leave on a note of saying that all of these people were being judgmental and Jesus was the good one. Because
Uh-huh.
that Jesus is a Jew as they are Jews, and they're talking about God and they're learning about who God is together. Sorry. So I just had to just pop that in. Yeah.
Yeah,
People
I
be people
appreciate,
and
yeah, I appreciate that. Thank you.
yeah. Yeah, and I appreciate that too, Teresa, because one of the books that we've talked through some and studied some together by Amy Jill Levine works really hard to unpack the anti-Semitism that's so often read in and woven into our interpretations of Scripture. So it's
Especially the parables. Yes.
yeah, it's so important that we
Yes.
continue to open ourselves up to that lens. Um, both honoring that people be peopling, so
People,
they
yeah,
out
yeah.
there they out there
We be
judging each
judgy.
other and deciding who's in and who's out and who's right and who's wrong,
Yes, yes.
but not in a way that is unique to being a Jew, and therefore we
People are
take
people.
that to
Yes.
other them.
Yes.
Yeah, so I
Yeah, yeah.
appreciate that caveat on all sides and the opportunity to
Well,
discuss.
thank you for having me. I really appreciate it. It was a very interesting conversation and uplifting, I think inspirational. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you. Thanks, Rick and Holly, for coming. And Gary, if you watch this later, we appreciate you being part of it. And friends that are watching online, if you see this on YouTube or Facebook, feel free to comment. We'll do our best to circle back and kind of address any questions or comments that come up, or send us a message and you can join us live. We'll send you the link to do so. And we'll have another Jesus 101 here in a couple weeks. And I think we're going to be looking at some of the teachings that weren't captured in the parables and how we understand them. So
Mhm.
more fun to have in Jesus 101. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Buddy, take care.
Bye.